The participants, the commentators, are all well-known scholars, eminent scholars in their fields. They represent, in particular, China, which is Professor David Bachman, who's been head of the China program here, and is a widely known, respected, and distinguished scholar of modern China, modern Chinese history and diplomacy. Kenneth Pyle is a preeminent scholar, historian of Japan, not only in Japanese history, but he also has been actively involved in policy advising and was a founder of the National Bureau for Asian Research. And Clark Sorensen, whom you've already been introduced, is the head of the Korea program, and I'm very well informed on that. Professor Ha is kind of the senior, Genro, to use a Japanese phrase, person on Korea, and he will add his comments kind of in the synthesizing overview. The goal is not so much to comment, but to pose questions as seen from the perspective of each of their countries that relate to and perhaps challenge the ambassador's position. And if they don't, I guarantee you I will. David, why don't you begin, and please come up here so we can be seen. And,
Thanks, Don, and particularly to Ambassador Hill for his very stimulating remarks. And I am going to try to pick up on Don's point about being provocative or challenging those remarks. And I'm not sure I'm going to accept Don's authority to limit my time. I have 5 or 6 points I want to make. One of them is the point that was a centerpiece of Ambassador Hill's talk, and that is we might call North Korean endism. How we all agree in this room that North Korea is an execrable regime, the world would be better off if it wasn't there. The question that this leaves out, of course, is how is that process to come about? The Chinese fear that the United States and South Korea want the Chinese to do the heavy lifting, to be the one to put the squeeze on the North Koreans, because after all, it's China that, by everyone's account, provides the key grain and oil supplies that keeps North Korea sort of functioning as opposed to not functioning at all. The Chinese are quite worried about what would happen if they actually put the squeeze on. Some of you, some of my students in the room may know that I often talk about the lesson, the so-called lesson that Daniel Yergin tells in his book, The Prize, about what happened when the United States put the squeeze on Japan in 1941. Japan's energy, 93% came from within the empire, coal. 7% was imported oil. Of that 7%, 80% came from the United States, which was the world's largest exporter in 1941. We assumed that this was going to force the Japanese to withdraw from China. The pressure of cutting off modern industry and oil was going to force the Japanese to rethink their policy. We know that the Japanese didn't respond as we quite anticipated. The Chinese are quite concerned, and there's been a lot of debate in China about North Korean policy. It's the one area of foreign policy where there are clear differences among academics who speak to the Politburo. One eminent Chinese scholar referred to the regime in North Korea in a U.S. Army publication as an illegitimate regime. So there's lots of disagreement in China about North Korea, but the leadership is concerned that if you put the squeeze on North Korea, they'll make the Japanese choice to go down fighting as opposed to collapsing or giving in or whatever. So this question of how the North Korean collapse is managed or created is the critical question here. I'd say also that you might find that China might be more amenable to a North Korean transition to a unified Korea if South Korea and the United States committed to a unified Korea agreeing to be neutral, dissolving the defense treaty with the United States, no U.S. troops on the peninsula. Is that acceptable to the United States? Would that be something acceptable to Korea? All of these things are part of the complexities related to this issue. I wanted to talk, as a second point, about Chinese nationalism. In Western papers, you would see this perception that China has been manufacturing this nationalism as a way to promote legitimacy, and there certainly is some of that. But nationalism has been the most powerful political force in China for the last 100 years or more. It is one that now reflects Chinese pride and Chinese achievements over the last 30 years. One that's given rise, quite rightly, as Ambassador Hill points out, to hubris, overconfidence, expectation that we can extrapolate straight out and China will be the world's biggest this, the world's biggest that, and everyone naturally will defer to China's bigness, if not its greatness. And I wanted to say that the leadership shares this. Indeed, politicians everywhere, one of the prerequisites for being a political leader is sharing pride in your country, being nationalists. The Chinese leadership is nationalist, the Chinese people are nationalist. They have their gripes, as everybody else does, but they have a great deal of pride here. So there's some manufacturing, but there's a sense that China sees itself as someone who should be deferred to, respected. We had until, let's say, Thursday, this dominant image in the US of Chinese nationalism run amok, that this was leading to conflict in the South China Sea, East China Sea, everywhere. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes agreements with the Japanese, comes agreements with the United States, and oh yes, buried inside the paper, the free trade agreement with South Korea. So this seems to suggest that nationalism is manageable, it can be muted, that it doesn't constrain as much as we think. A fourth point I want to make is about the pivot. I was asked last month to go down to Joint Base Lewis McChord and give a speech to many of the officers there. And I was sitting with the commanding general of 1st Corps, and he asked me to tell him what the pivot was. Because he said, when he goes to Asia, everybody else asks him what the pivot is. The heads of state or the military in Bangladesh and Southeast Asia and so on. So they see the military dimension of the pivot, but he couldn't give an answer for what the pivot was other than shifting of attention. So in that sense, what is it that this pivot is supposed to be other than vague attention? And of course, anyone who studies U.S. foreign policy knows that the short term drives out the longer term, that holding an agenda focused on long-term American interests in Asia is going to fall victim to Arab Springs, seizures of Crimea, and all sorts of other things in ways that don't reassure our allies, raise doubts among the Chinese about what's going on, and create, exactly as said, unintended consequences that make the situation worse. A fifth point I want to make is I'd simply note that the core goal of foreign policy for China is a defensive one, and that is to make sure it is never at the top of the U.S. foreign policy agenda. And thanks to the Arab Spring, Crimea, and so many other things, China has been quite successful at doing that. They know that as long as that's the case, various interests in U.S. politics will prevent this type of sort of focused response on China, which allows China to do many of the things it wants to do. And my final point concerns the title of the talk about dynamics in Asia. It strikes me there are many other dynamics here that weren't brought up or that we need to think of in a somewhat medium to long-term perspective. So one of them is the nature of the Chinese-South Korean relationship. So South Korea exports more to China than it exports to the United States and Japan combined. There are more Korean students, South Korean students in China than in the U.S. And there are other aspects of the relationship that suggest that China might be more effective at dealing with North Korea, can cut a deal with South Korea about North Korea perhaps more effectively than the U.S. can. So that's one dimension here. But then there are the sort of longer term, less obvious dimensions. So pretty soon, South Korea's population is going to start to decline, along with Japan's already declining population, Taiwan's declining population. China's population is not going to start to decline for a while. One of the things that international relations specialists have speculated on but haven't devoted sort of considerable thought to is, what does demographic decline mean for international relations? Obviously, it means that Samsung, Hyundai are going to be selling less products in South Korea. It may force South Korea to be more internationalized. But what does that mean for national conceptions, national identities, and ideas about what the future of international relations hold? I agree with Ambassador Hill that there should be much more multilateralism in Asia, in any number of contexts. But what we're missing here is the kind of work that Anne-Marie Slaughter has done about informal policy networks that unite the United States and Europe. A new world order, as she called it back in the early 2000s, of where policy groups in various countries formed informal groups. We don't have much of an idea about the informal networks that combine or don't combine China, Korea, North Korea, Japan, and so on. And so perhaps we're looking at the obvious and we're missing what may become new and determining factors for foreign policy down the road. We could, obviously, going back to the pivot, that the United States also does dumb things. This shouldn't come as a new insight to those of us who study American foreign policy from time to time, but the U.S. opposition to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, trying to keep South Korea and Australia out of it, while at the same time not providing any more money to the ADB, the Asia Development Bank, or to the World Bank, or providing any more U.S. foreign aid. So we're saying, we don't like what the Chinese are doing, but we're not going to compensate. We're simply going to tell you you shouldn't have this. So what are the Chinese supposed to draw from that? What are Asians supposed to draw from that? Is this a pivot? How is that helping us in our foreign policy? So with that, I will turn it over to whoever's next.
David, not only with my assent, of course, exceeded the limit, but proved he was feisty, so much so that I'm going to ask him to speak next, but then provide an opportunity for the ambassador to respond to this list of challenges that he has. I will have to limit his response as well, but let's do it that way. Ken, will you please?
Well, thank you, Ambassador, for a very stimulating talk. I also want to thank my good friend, Professor Ha, and his colleagues for initiating this forum, which I think has wonderful possibilities for the future. I'd like to address my comments particularly to recent developments in Japan, which I think the ambassador alluded to, but which are really of great importance to the nature of these changes that are underway right now in Japan are of great importance to the fundamental dynamics of the region for the future. What I mean by that is, it seems to me that Japan is in the midst of a sea change in its post-war foreign policy. Japan historically has always adjusted its foreign policy to the changes in the international environment. That's true of all countries, I suppose, to an extent, but it's particularly true of Japan with its pragmatism, its realism, and its tendency in foreign policy to adapt. So what has been happening in Japan, particularly in the last 2 years under Prime Minister Abe, is a redefinition, an ambitious effort to redefine Japan's international role. This has been a kind of quiet revolution up until this past summer when the Prime Minister announced a reinterpretation of the Constitution and of Article 9 to make possible collective defense for the first time in the post-war period. You have to understand that Japan during the Cold War basically abstained from this conflict, made the best of a bad situation, having been occupied and having an alliance imposed upon them. And so the Japanese had a foreign policy strategy that Henry Kissinger and others never recognized until it was really passed. And that was to adopt a series of self-binding policies which would keep them out of the Cold War and would withstand American pressure to participate in the Cold War. So the fundamental goal of this, the fundamental policies of this strategy was a series of self-binding policies. And if you think about them, it's really quite astonishing. So Japan said, we will not have any overseas deployment of our self-defense forces. We will not participate in collective defense. We will not have any power projection capabilities. We will not become a nuclear power. We will not export arms. We will not share defense-related technology. We will never spend more than 1% of GNP on our defense, and we will not engage in military use of space. These self-abnegating policies were a kind of brilliant strategy for the Cold War, but it left Japan at the end of the Cold War without a foreign policy in terms of defending itself, other than complete dependence on the United States for its security. So in recent years, what we've been seeing under Abe and also earlier under Koizumi and even Nakasone was a quiet and incremental, kind of slow adaptation to the new post-Cold War environment. And all of those self-abnegating policies have been quietly changed, except for the nuclear one. And in that case, it's even no longer taboo to discuss it. And so all of those negative self-abnegating policies have been gradually modified, and the most striking one was Abe's reinterpretation of the Constitution this summer. So Beijing has made it much easier for Abe to achieve this by its bluster and even bullying of Japan. And Abe's popularity has really held up close to 50%, between 45 and 50% approval rating. So the announcement, the striking announcement of reinterpretation of the Constitution is something the Americans have been wanting for decades, and it will undoubtedly lead to a tighter U.S.-Japan alliance, a more active foreign policy on the part of the Japanese, and we can see that Abe has also created a National Security Council, passed a law to maintain greater secrecy of government policies and discussions, and has, for the first time, really formulated a clear foreign policy strategy. So all of those things add up to Japan in the dynamics of Northeast Asia becoming a much more active player and supported by a younger generation in Japan, which strongly supports a much more, shall we say, assertive and prominent player in the international affairs of the region. What is less understood, it seems to me, and less appreciated in thinking about Abe's agenda is the fact that I think that he, like his grandfather, Prime Minister Kishi, also seeks much greater autonomy in foreign policy. And by that I mean autonomy from the U.S. alliance. In the short run, obviously he needs a strong U.S.-Japan alliance in the face of China's rise. But in the longer term, it seems to me that Abe desires a much more independent foreign policy. He doesn't like, he must grind his teeth when Joe Biden comes over and urges him not to go to Yasukuni Shrine, or Richard Armitage suggests that they build a new shrine in place of Yasukuni. The alliance with Japan, the U.S. alliance with Japan has left Japan in a kind of uniquely dependent relationship on the United States. It's been a hegemonic alliance, and I think, although this is not discussed by Abe, I think in his heart of hearts, he really wants a much more independent foreign policy. So with that, I'll pass it on to Clark.
I'm going to, as I indicated a moment ago, we're going to take a brief break in my announced agenda to allow Ambassador Hill to respond to the first two. And I must ask him to heed, it's futile advice, but heed to the time limits so that we can get the audience involved in the discussion going more fully. Please, and then we'll move on to Clark.
Okay, well, I'll try to be brief in the interest of moving this along. First of all, I agree with a lot of David's points about China, but obviously there's some I would phrase differently. I think the question of how North Korea is somehow brought to the understanding that it cannot keep its nuclear ambitions is obviously the critical question. I completely agree with that. I do believe, however, if the North Koreans were to perceive a systematized U.S., Chinese, ROK, maybe throw in the Russians as well, if they saw a systematized effort on this, I think they would be looking to see what they could get for that nuclear arsenal rather than to continue it. And I agree with the concept that there's some risk here. That is the risk that they would, quote, go down fighting. I agree with that, but I think there's also some risk to where we are today, which is to simply have a situation where North Korea is developing nuclear weapons. Sooner or later, they will put one on a missile. Maybe more ominously, sooner or later, they'll put one on an artillery shell. I think that's tremendous risk. And that we would have acquiesced in the nuclearization of North Korea, which is clearly their aim. Their aim is to have sort of constant talks with us, and sort of at some point we'll accept them in a way that we've accepted India as a nuclear country. So I think that is more risky than a comprehensive U.S.-Chinese effort to put this at the top of the agenda and come to an understanding that we will really not tolerate North Korea's continued building of its nuclear arsenal. I would completely rule out, and I mean completely, any efforts by the U.S. and China to somehow limit South Korean sovereignty if South Korea becomes a successor state. It is completely unacceptable to say something like, okay, South Korea, you can have North Korea, but you can never keep the U.S. alliance. That is for South Korea to determine, not for China to determine. So this notion that we can Finlandize South Korea, I think it would simply be completely unsustainable. With respect to Chinese nationalism, I think it's definitely there, and I think it's there in the context of a governing structure that's increasingly kind of looking for its central role to play. And I think without nationalism, I think the Chinese Communist Party has an increasingly difficult explanation for what it does for the country, and it becomes increasingly questioned. So much so that I think some of this nationalism that you see on the internet is essentially an effort to kind of squeeze the government by saying, you claim to be protecting us, but why are you allowing the Vietnamese to get away with this kind of stuff? So I think nationalism is played with a great deal in China today, and I think there's some dangerous dynamics there. With regard to population decline, I think you're quite right. Japan is already on the right side of the curve. They're going down. I think it has tremendous implications. If you look at the projections of Japanese population decline in the next 100 years, you're looking at a country that will be roughly 2/3 of what it is today, and it's even in some projections more dramatic than that. How Japan's going to manage this, how international trade is going to manage this, I think is a big question, and it will definitely have some effect on dynamics. South Korea is also will be going down, but South Korea has proved to be much less concerned about immigration. You see some 2 million Filipinos and others living in South Korea today. So I think South Korea will, like the United States, kind of moderate the decline through some kind of immigration process. When President Obama went to Japan a year or two ago, the Japanese brought out and showed him these wonderful little robots that would, make your bed or, vacuum clean your house. It was really a statement against immigration that was Japanese technical prowess. So I think Japan does have to think this through and consider, like many countries in the world, including our own, consider some new immigration policies. And as for the U.S. churlishness on the Chinese infrastructure bank, I completely agree. I think, unless we're willing to do a lot more and we're not, it seems kind of unsustainable to be telling countries not to join this and to kind of tell them that China is some sort of threat in this process. China makes a lot of mistakes in its international lending. You can see some of those mistakes. You go down to East Timor. East Timor has the world's biggest foreign ministry right now. I mean, you can practically see it from outer space, and you sort of wonder why East Timor has it. And the answer is the Chinese built it, and there was absolutely no concept of what they were doing. It was clearly a case where what goes for Chinese foreign assistance is often simply a subsidy to its construction ministries, etc. I can tell you, though, we've made a lot of dumb mistakes, as David alluded to, in the past, and we continue to make them. So I think we can learn from each other on some of these things. Turning, because I'm very respectful of the time issue here, Ken, I think, laid out an analysis of Japan that I would really share. I would say that some of these trends are worrisome. I think it is worrisome to dispense with Article 9, to begin to try to project forces to develop all kinds of new systems without really dealing with the historical question. And this is not about building another Yasukuni or something. I think there is a history there, and I think Japan has to do a little better job of dealing with that. And I know the Japanese resent this terribly. I know they don't like to be told this, I know it rankles them, but frankly, they shouldn't have to be told, they should be doing something about this. When I spent a lot of time in Poland, and one of the great stories of Poland is when the German Chancellor came to Warsaw and was supposed to be laying a wreath at a memorial there, and doing it the way, you have two soldiers put down the wreath, and then you bow slightly, and that's the end of the wreath laying. Instead, Willy Brandt goes up, takes the wreath himself, puts it down there, drops to his knees, and begs forgiveness. Every Pole today knows that story, and that is why you never hear about Polish-German problems. Almost never hear about those problems, thanks to what Willy Brandt did that day in Warsaw. You know, I mean, look, not everyone can be Willy Brandt, but I think some more can be done there, and I hope Japan is prepared to do that. By the way, just picking up one more thing, because it's both involved with Ken and David. David, I don't buy the idea that China ended World War II because we squeezed their scrap metal. The reason Japan was involved in World War II is they had a system that took them way off the rails through the 1930s. That militarism of the 1930s led them directly to war. And the reason we were starting to squeeze their scrap metal was precisely they had already invaded several countries, including China. They had annexed South Korea, and I think or all of Korea. I think in every respect, Japan was what it was, which was an ally of Nazi Germany. And so I think we need to take a kind of longer-term perspective on these things and understand that when you have systems that call for that, always combine this kind of chauvinism with the other side of it, which is paranoia and sort of feeling that no one understands them and they're the victims. Show me a victim and I'll show you an aggressive person. And so I think the Japanese have a lot to think through as they kind of do these things that Ken described. One other thing I would say is one of Abe's chief concerns has been to repair this economy, and so far the results are mixed. And while I think Abe has made his priorities clear about the economy, and it's the economy more than it is Article 9 that he's focused on, I think that has been welcomed, but I think he has a long way to go. Certainly the third arrow, as he called it, the structural reforms, has been a very, it has not really found its mark at this point, and I think we have to kind of stay tuned to see how Japan goes. I must say, I hope U.S. troops remain in Japan. I think U.S. troops in Japan are in everyone's interest. I don't think you can have a situation where U.S. troops are only in Korea. So I think it's been very valuable to have U.S. troops there, and I hope that deployment continues.
You've been sitting here very attentively for a long time, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks as brief as possible. And I'm just going to raise a couple of ideas. One of them that I want to start with echoes something that David said about nationalism. And when I think about nationalism in China, Japan, or Korea, there's nothing new about it. It's been a constant, at least since World War II, if not before. And so I don't think nationalism, whether it's rising or falling, really explains any kind of foreign policy. I think one reason I approach this a little bit different than Ambassador Hill is that I'm an anthropologist, and he's a diplomat, and he talks to high-level, very powerful people, and I talk to mid-level intellectuals and unpowerful people, and I get a different picture as to what Koreans, different Koreans, think. One of the things that's been most striking in recent years in Korea is the discourse on multiculturalism. Ambassador Hill mentioned it briefly about the immigrant Filipinos, but it's more than that. More than 15% of all marriages in Korea now are with non-Koreans. This is something unprecedented in Korean history, and this discourse of multiculturalism is an attempt to deal with the fact that there are all these mixed marriages between ethnic Filipinos and ethnic Koreans, Russians and Koreans, Indonesians and Koreans, Japanese, you name it. they're all in Korea. And in fact, the more remote the village you go to, the higher the proportion of multicultural marriages, so that the really remote villages, 50% or more of all marriages are these multicultural marriages. So I think nationalism is definitely there, but there's this multiculturalism as well. So I'm not sure this nationalism really explains very much. If I turn to just one other point I want to mention, and then I'll kind of shut up for the night, has to do with how unification may or may not take place. And I don't disagree with anything Ambassador Hill said on this, except I'd like to hear some more concrete ideas about what diplomacy would work. I've always advocated for something that Ambassador Hill mentioned, that the U.S. should be telling China a lot about what we wouldn't do if Korea unified. I don't know if the U.S. has ever told China that, so it would be interesting to hear what Ambassador Hill knows on that issue. It's not public knowledge, so I'd like to hear about that. I also wonder if one country, two systems might work for Korea, like it kind of semi-works for China. That might be a model that's different than the Finlandization model, or the, South Korea takes over North Korea model. So those are just a couple of remarks. And finally, one thing that hasn't been mentioned that I think we ought to bring up is that the United States isn't the only country that's pivoting toward Asia. Russia is doing the same thing. They want to export fuel to China because they don't want to be totally dependent on European markets, and that makes sense. But they're also interested in reactivating their relationship with North Korea, so that for North Korea, China isn't the only game in town. And I'd like to hear Ambassador Hill's thoughts about that as well.
Well, it's not easy to speak last because everybody sort of said all the good things. But let me try. I want to make two or three observations and comments, and then two questions directed to Ambassador Hill. Excuse me. Looking at what's going on in Northeast Asia, East Asia in general, what I see is I would say, sort of compensating their own past, meaning imperialism, war and division, ideological conflicts. Only finally now, East Asia is recovering, trying to recover from the past wounds to the future stability. So it's going to take a long while before we see anything stable in the region. Then the question becomes, what is the United States going to do during this kind of what they call long transition period? To me, that's the very critical question to the United States. In that regard, I want to point out that the United States, whether the pivot or whatever, it does not have any vision. It does not. And then, to me, what's so surprising about President Obama, for example, in regard to the strategic patience with North Korea, what I see there is there's no strategy, only patience. Sort of making us wait too long. And then, so also pivot in Asia simply to me, adding 200 something the Marines to Australia. That's about it. I don't know what is happening within the State Department or within the Washington D.C. what they call the Beltline. That's why we need this kind of talk, the outside of Washington D.C. Anyhow, to me, what's going to be a long-term perspective of U.S. policy in East Asia or Northeast Asia? To me, that's my first observation. It's going to be, why? Because you said nationalism, whatever, the defensive or otherwise, yes. And there's multiculturalism, yes. So everything is going on in Northeast Asia. Scholars wanted to focus on one aspect, for their own theory or concept situation, but it's not going to work in the case of Northeast Asia. Even when I talk to many Chinese scholars, they say within their lifetime, there's not going to be any Chinese island theories in that region. And then the other point is more about South Korea. What the Japanese or Chinese do not understand about South Korea is exactly how much South Korea has changed. I was so much surprised to see this. That the fact that South Korean society has been democratized, probably to the level of the expectation beyond what normally South Koreans think about themselves. It's a very truly remarkable phenomenon. I would say South Korean democracy probably most turbulent but most active and flourishing even compared to many other countries, particularly compared to Japan. So particularly what the message to be sent to Japan, I think Japan has taken for granted too much the old type of relationship between Japan and South Korea. I think it's high time for them to recognize how much South Korea has changed. And then in the lesson, this point, I want to make another point. That is I was talking with Pastor Hill before we came over here. What is so critical about the whole region, including South Korea and Japan, is to what extent elites now in control over their own society. To me, this is a very, very significant issue. Let's say, as long as we can think that the Abe or other leaders in Japan, they think they can manage to put the lid on the level of nationalism in Japan. I think there's no concern. There's no need for worrying about that. But if indeed Japanese society passes a certain point, beyond certain point where the elite cannot manage their society, then I think we're in trouble. Likewise, the over-democratized South Korea, what I see there is a very interesting phenomenon where the Korean masses now have almost become uncontrollable. So much so that the now Korean elites now in this array. I mean, they don't know what to do with the Korean masses. Likewise, when I look at the Chinese society, as long as the government provides some opportunities for making money, then Chinese people keep silent. But otherwise, they will start doing something against or for the government. So we should take a close look at this elite mass dynamics and looking at whether the issue of nationalism or otherwise. Okay, now my direct question to Ambassador Hill. That is, you said that you still maintain that the six-party formula is effective, or should continue to work within the context of six-party talks. Maybe for devil's advocate, I would say the otherwise. For example, for me, the six-party formula has served its own purpose, as you said. But then I doubt whether it will work in the future for several reasons. For one, North Korean nuclear status has completely changed compared to the beginning of the six-party talks. Now, North Korea claims their nuclear power. The stakes now have become much higher than the original point of 2003 or something. And then also the six-party talk has become too cumbersome in holding. What kind of conference talk is this? I mean, when it took sometimes more than 2 years before any one meeting could be held. And then thirdly, there were too much bilateralizing tendencies within the six-party talks. So even within the formal six-party talk format, actually at critical points, the bilateral relationship actually worked out their own problems. And then finally, what I call nuclear dilemma of North Korea. I mean, the longer the talks drag on, the more the nuclear system in North Korea developed, so that it created this, some sort of dilemma to be handled. So my suggestion is this. Now, we should look at the 1994 formula of Geneva, the agreement. I mean, similar kind of thing. So rather than sort of holding on to this kind of strategic patience without bringing much results, I hope the United States and South Korea should work together to negotiate, to start negotiating with North Korea. So in a sense, the constituting sort of a three-party talks, and then adding China, and so making four-party talks. And then later on, the six-party talk formula could sort of ratify whatever the results could be made in the end. That's my kind of question to you. And then my final point is about exactly somehow I love the diplomatic sort of idea about multilateralizing and then talking for the sake of talk. All this. Now, I think we need that. However, as I maintained earlier, we need to see some kind of projection of vision coming out of the United States, so that at least during a turbulent period of time facing Northeast Asian countries, the U.S. could manipulate or manage or control the level of crisis to the minimum level. Thank you very much.
Exercising my prerogative as a moderator to ask one question. And it really is derivative from the fact that the ambassador is now a dean and has forced to deal with the academic world. If you look at Northeast Asia, and particularly the Korean Peninsula, say from the perspective of 100 years from now, what will be astonishing is this will be a region which by then will be the largest, most prosperous region in the world, be bigger than the United States. Maybe that will happen very shortly. What is astonishing is that Pyongyang has successfully stayed out of that. That's a major diplomatic achievement. I mean, how a country can retain its, whatever you want to call it, gulag and suffering, while the rest of its neighbors, and now even with Putin pouring $22 billion to rebuild Vladivostok and snuggling up to China, even Russia in the Far East component in Siberia will do. So my question is this: why did the United States, when it was almost by definition the sole hegemonic power in the world at the end of the Cold War, not find a way? We're not talking about vision, we're not talking, how could they not come up with a way of dealing with China, with the North Korean Peninsula? I mean, there are so many conceivable ways where American initiatives could have done it. That is probably the only historically strange thing, other than the rise, or the failure of North Korea to set the diplomatic agenda for the United States, for China, for Russia. I think that's one of the most astonishing historical feats ever. And maybe there should be a Kim Il-sung School of Diplomacy or something. I don't know. How could this happen? And how could the United States not respond? Please do.
Okay, well, let me start with Clark's question about, first of all, I'd like to hear some more concrete ideas, and that is a very fair point to make. My approach in the six-party talks was the following. I knew that North Korea, with respect to North Korean denuclearization, I knew they didn't want to do it, and I knew that this notion that you could have them make a strategic choice, that is fall out of bed one morning and say, okay, we're going to get rid of our nuclear weapons, wasn't going to happen. So I took the view that we should kind of shift them incrementally in the direction of doing away with their nuclear weapons. So I worked with with Sung Min Soon, the South Korean representative to the six-party talks. We'd meet up on top of the Plaza Hotel, which was walking distance from the Foreign Ministry and from the American Embassy, and we'd discuss how we should try to get something going in this process, because the problem had been up until then, you'd have a meeting, nothing much would happen, and the press would all get very skeptical of the six-party talks, even more skeptical than Professor Ha has been. I'm coming to you in a second on that. So what we did was we came up with the idea that how about just getting one sheet of paper, and we just say what North Korea should do and what the rest of us are prepared to do. So this went through a lot of iterations, but the idea was nothing would necessarily get implemented at that when the paper was accepted. I mean, Yongbyon would continue to belch along and produce the spent fuel to be used for nuclear, to be reprocessed into plutonium. So the North Koreans weren't being asked to do anything at that point, but they would have crossed an important river there, and that was they would say that they have agreed to abandon all their nuclear programs. So that was what we were prepared to. Sung Min Soon and I figured out we got to put that in there. And then we agreed that what we do is start talking to the North Koreans and say, what would you want? What's important to you? Now, there's an old line that people can never get enough of what they don't want. And so the North Koreans would start putting elements in there, and frankly, you weren't really sure if they really cared about it, but you said, okay, you want that? We'll put that in there. Energy help, economic assistance, cross-recognition of states, non-aggression pact. So we started putting the whole shooting match in there. And it began to look like, you know, North Korea is giving up their nuclear weapons, and we're giving up a whole list of things. And so the concept was you get the North Koreans to accept this piece of paper. And by the way, we had a lot of things we had to do there. And by the way, it wasn't easy because there was a vice president named Dick Cheney who didn't like to do anything. I mean, except he could not come up with a single alternative strategy, which is what drives you nuts about people like that. And I'm coming to you, Professor Ha. Anyway, so we took that, and then I told the Chinese, I said, we can't have this 3 and out thing, which is you arrive on Tuesday, talk on Wednesday, and the Chinese give a statement on Thursday, which no one has actually agreed to. So I told Wu Dawei, we need to stay until we have an agreement. I got all this kind of stuff from the Dayton Peace Accords, which had been 10 years before. So I remember Wu Dawei was a little worried about the Foreign Ministry's food budget, but he said, okay, we'll do that. So we stayed for some 3 weeks, and we essentially got the North Koreans to accept a piece of paper that included denuclearization. And our view was that by having that, then we take the negotiation from being a negotiation of whether you're getting rid of your nuclear weapons to a negotiation of how you implement your getting rid of nuclear weapons. Well, obviously not everything worked well, because the first thing that happened is another branch of the U.S. government found some North Korean accounts in a bank in Macau called Banco Delta Asia. Before you knew it, we had impounded $23 million worth of North Korean accounts, and the North Koreans refused to go to the talks. We went for a year and a half without getting anywhere. But we finally got to the point that what we were really doing was implementing in phases the approach, the agreement. So that was what we tried to do. Ultimately, we could not succeed because the North Koreans, every time you get something for them, they acted like they hadn't even asked for it. So they just didn't seem in. They seemed only interested in things until you succeeded in getting them, and then they lost interest. They're very difficult people to work with. So that was certainly a problem. And then what ultimately killed the talks was the fact that the North Koreans, they would not allow us to verify what they had agreed to do. They would only allow us to visit sites that they had already declared. We wanted to have the right to do challenge inspections, and that's ultimately what happened to the talks. Why the North Koreans took a harder position, hard to say. Kim Jong-il, you recall, in the summer of 2008, became Kim Jong very ill when he had a stroke, and so, whether it was his demise, who knows, but we were not able to follow it up. But Clark, I just want to assure you, we really did work on concrete ideas to try to negotiate this, and the Chinese were part of that. But I think ultimately the North Koreans tried to find differences in the way we dealt with each other. And so, I had to make sure that the Russians, who agreed with us but would always say the wrong thing just because they like to say the wrong thing. And so you have to work with the Russians and say this is very important. We'd have to get our people in Washington to be calling Russians and telling them this is important, this is what we're trying to do on Tuesday. So we really tried to work it. See, just one other point from Clark on the pivot. You're right, there's kind of less than meets the eye so far. The U.S. military has chopped more forces to the Pacific than ever before, so it's more than just the issue of the Australian deployment. It also, I think, was the U.S. Was prepared to join the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN process, and to be much more of a player in the multilateral game in East Asia. So I think to some extent people correctly analyzed it as a greater effort by the U.S. And remember, it was in the context of having elected a president who spent some of his formative years in Indonesia. So there's some sense that we were going to do something with that. So the pivot, I think ultimately was oversold, but I think it was also an effort to say, look, American people, we've bombed enough mud huts in Afghanistan, we now need to start thinking about our future a little more. So I think it was more an exhortation than concrete steps. Let me get on to Professor Ha's point about the six-party talks. If I thought the 16-party talks or the 66-party talks or the one-party talks would solve this, I'd go for it immediately. I could care less how many parties there are. What is important is for the North Koreans to agree to implement what they've already agreed to, which is the abandonment of their nuclear programs. The 6 parties were not chosen randomly. First of all, it was the concept that the U.S. is not the only country with a stake in this. We needed to make sure that other countries cared about this. And this was the animating concept behind President Bush and Jung Se-min's decision to launch the 6-party talks. Secondly, it was carefully balanced. You could not just have South Korea, even though South Korea was absolutely essential. They have a whole peninsula plan. In fact, some of the issues that made, some of the issues in the 6-party talks were developed out of various peninsula negotiations a few years before. So South Korea had to be in. But if South Korea was going to be in, you had to, from the North Korean perspective, you had to have some balance. So there was the idea that Russia should be in. So Russia, China. Japan was difficult because of the difficult period that the South Koreans were having with the Japanese. At the same time, I think it was deemed very important that Japan not be a sort of island country with its own policy on this, that Japan needed to be part of a multilateral structure. I must say that one of the things we did in the 6-party, if you look at that September 05 document, was to create a Northeast Asia peace and security mechanism. And the point of that was to begin this kind of multilateral process. And we had some meetings on the Northeast Asia Peace and Security Mechanism, meetings that were designed to raise everything except the nuclear issue. So we're trying to show the North Koreans, look, you're a charter member of this is going to be interesting to you, and not everything we're going to talk about here is to bash you on nuclear weapons, and this is one of them. The North Koreans, how to put it, were not in the mood for this. First, they denounced the Japanese, then they denounced the U.S., then they denounced the South Koreans. This was in one meeting. And just as I was picking up the sports page to check baseball scores, they started denouncing the Russians and the Chinese as well. So they were not quite in the spirit of this multilateralism, but I still think it was kind of the right way to go. Whether in the future there's a six-party process or something else, I think we need a multilateral process. The six parties were a platform to do a lot of different things. And Professor, you're quite correct that there were bilateral talks, but there were trilateral talks, quadrilateral talks, there were a lot of different things. And by the way, welcome to multilateral diplomacy. A lot of things, I mean, look at what happened at the APEC meeting. The key questions were how Putin and Xi Jinping were talking, how Putin and Obama were talking, how Obama and Xi Jinping. I mean, the key meetings are often bilateral, and that's just the nature of the beast. So I don't think the fact that there are a lot of bilateral talks is something means that the six-party talks can't work. And by the way, we did kind of open it up to other countries that were interested in providing some economic assistance to the North Koreans. And we would have done more provided the North Koreans were interested in fulfilling their obligations. And frankly, they walked away from it.
Now it's time for questions from the audience, and to assure that there is broader participation, I think what we'll do is collect, say, 3 or 4 questions, and then I can control the ambassador easier than I can control the speeches and talks of him. So if you're called upon, please no speeches, ask the question, and if you don't, please.
I think it could be useful to hear audience ideas without letting anyone take too long, because there are completely other points of view which might be useful.
Well, I would not dispute that, but we have a large audience, lots of informed people, I guarantee you that, and people who have very strong feelings about this. And having done, I won't tell you how many programs like this, I feel constrained to put permanents. Now, if there are questions, would you please raise your hands? I will recognize them, and then we will do appeal. Please. Yeah, please identify you.
My question is, right now, pending before the United Nations is a possible referral of the Commission of Inquiry's finding that North Korea has committed crimes against humanity. There's a vote that the General Assembly could take, and there's a vote that the Security Council could take. Most people assume that China would, if forced to, veto that referral. I'd like to hear Ambassador Hill's thoughts on that, and perhaps the thoughts of the experts from China and South Korea.
Yes. Thank you for a clear and interesting question. Yes.
My name is Maya Coons, and my question is, you said that China was the only country doing business as usual with North Korea, but it seems that Russia is actually doing quite a lot of business with North Korea, so I would like to hear your thoughts.
Okay, the role of Russia. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm Consul General Moon. Very nice to hear directly from Ambassador here. I would like to know your personal assessment on North Korean uranium enrichment program. Little is known there, but it has something to do with the international community's negotiations with Iran. I'd like to know your assessment. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yes, please. This will be a 4th one, then we'll stop and he will quickly answer.
I'm Mike Park. I got a practical question to Ambassador Hill. Very recently, North Korea released 2 U.S. citizens. One individual from the Kenneth base from local. As a local politician, what my citizen seeing is not true fiction. There's a lot of behind-the-scene politics, wrestling, and sometimes a power game. So one of the Japanese famous minister defined politics as art of negotiation and compromise. So I'd like to inform based on your experience, what kind of probable conversation and dialogue between U.S. and North Korea? to release those two U.S. citizens.
Okay. And how fast can you speak?
On the first issue, I'm in favor of a referral of North Korea, and I would hope that we would work with the Chinese such that they would not veto. And I think if China vetoes the referral of North Korea, which they might do, I think it's another example where China simply doesn't understand the way the rest of the world thinks about this. You know, certainly China will try to say, oh, this is all a U.S. conspiracy. It's not. And so anyone who knows Michael Kirby knows he's not some person doing the U.S. bidding. So I would kind of like to sharpen the choice for China. And obviously we need to work with the Chinese ahead of time. But I think it's high time that everyone was, including the Chinese, were clear about these human rights violations. You know, the North Koreans used to complain, and I'd say, look, you're producing nuclear weapons, you've got the world's worst world's worst human rights record, so this is your future. Everyone's coming after you because everyone dislikes you for this, and you know, you've made your choice, and this is what's happening. I would tell them that very clearly. I told Mr. Kim Dae-hwan that on many occasions. So I'd like to see some of what I said to him come true. And I think the Chinese, you know, they got to stop just sort of changing the subject when these issues come up. So I would welcome it for one. On the issue of Russia also trading with North Korea, you're right, they're doing it as well. But the real issue is China. China essentially displaced South Korean and Japanese trade with North Korea. I don't think Russia's ever been that kind of player. But you're absolutely right. Nobody should be trading with them. And I would certainly try to include Russia in this. And that's why I think there ought to be more six-party meetings, even if there are only five-party meetings right now, to try to, you know, kind of keep everyone on the same page. And for people to say, well, everything's terrible with Russia, everything is terrible with Russia, but one of the reasons I think we need to have the six parties is we need Russia on Iran, we need Russia on Syria. I would keep after them on this and not, you know, not back off. God, I can't read my handwriting on the next question. The last one was Mr. Park's question on release of citizens. Who asked the question before us?
Consul General, he wants to know details on the enhancement of energy.
Oh, uranium.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Somebody else learned some handwriting there. North Korea was producing plutonium. That was a fact. We could see it from the air. It was happening. And that was what their nuclear arsenal was. So job number one, shut down the plutonium and try to disable it, eventually dismantle it, and eventually get it out of there. Job one. But at the same time, we had to keep the door open to exploring what they were doing on uranium enrichment because we knew they had made purchases of equipment that were entirely consistent with a uranium enrichment program. So throughout the talks with North Korea, we kept that door open. We never agreed to the idea that they don't have a uranium enrichment program. But it was very important not to hold up the control of the plutonium program by saying, well, you know, we really need to, explore the uranium enrichment program, because meanwhile they were making plutonium. So we decided let's shut down the plutonium program, but not agree to close the door to the uranium enrichment. It finally floundered or failed over the issue of our right to do inspections of suspected uranium enrichment sites. So I think we handled that right. The neoconservatives would argue we ignored uranium enrichment. We did not ignore uranium enrichment. It came up all the time. But we didn't want to have a situation where we made the best the enemy of the good. And a good agreement was to shut down the plutonium and keep the way forward on uranium enrichment, not to wait for them to come clean on uranium enrichment while meanwhile they have a plutonium program. So that's how we manage that. And I'm not sure of the connection to Iran because that would keep us here till 3 in the morning. But my own view is this interim accord with Iran is serious, and I think we ought to stay with it. And if we have to extend the date on November 24th, we should extend the date because I think this could be extremely important to our interests, and I think we should stay with this Iran program. Finally, on the release of citizens, that was a very welcome gesture. Obviously, the North Koreans wanted a senior official. I think President Obama made the right choice by having General Clapper. I don't know if you've ever talked to General Clapper, but he is a man of few words, and he is not interested in coming back from a meeting like that and claiming he's opened up some new channel to North Korea. He is not interested in that type of how to put it, he's not a former governor.
Thank you. That was, you'll never make it as an auctioneer, but you certainly substantively have dealt with it. Any more questions, please? We're getting, yes, please.
What are the probabilities of internal change in North Korea in terms of perhaps a coup d'etat of some sort? Probably very unrealistic, but what often was it?
Great. Yes, please.
I was hoping the ambassador could expand on what he thinks the consequences of Japan changing Article 9 might be in a greater Asian zone.
Okay. Yes.
My name is Leon Tvachnik, and I wondered if North Korea will ever admit the sinking of the South Korean ship, the naval ship, several years ago.
Yeah. Thank you.
Which was proven to be
The case, yes, 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 no, I understand. Any more questions? If not, this will take us, oh, I'm sorry, yes, way in the back. Yeah, that's good enough. Yes, and why, since there's only one more, I'm not going to shut you up. This is the last question.
Hi, so I was just curious about Ambassador Hill's comments. He had said that given that Asia was a confrontation with China, yet it somehow seems to have been the case that China just interpreted that. And it was also mentioned that Korea, there was comments about Korea being sort of a balance between or middle ground between China and the U.S. and so forth, and how that's not the case, that we actually encourage, or we're actually supposed to be encouraging Korea to cooperate with China, that we don't see this competition, but it seems that the message in Korea and in China has been that this is a confrontation and we are sort of competing with China for Korea influence. I'm wondering how we could have messaged all of this better, if there was a better way of messaging this.
Thank you, and you can answer them in any order.
Yeah. Well, first of all, on what are the prospects for internal change, I suspect it'll come at a date that surprises us in a way that surprises us. I would not be surprised if it's some kind of coup d'etat. I mean, I think that is as likely as anything else. I think certainly Kim Jong-un is in charge. I mean, there are a lot of theories that he's not, but I think he is in charge. It's probably more stable than it looks. I mean, than all the buffoonery would suggest. I suspect it's more stable, but I would not be surprised if we woke up and there was some coup d'etat, which is why it's quite understandable when he disappears for a month. Speculation runs rampant. I think some kind of soft landing with regard to North Korea, becoming more economically open. That would be a kind of soft landing, a sort of how did Clark put it? One Korea, two systems. that would be, you know, a very painless way to get through this nuclear issue. I don't think, however, North Korea can loosen up without essentially losing control. The problem is that any North Korean who has the possibility of living in South Korea basically goes. You know, China was able to pull this off, and that's why I think for many Chinese it's a concept that worked for them, and why not work for North Korea? But for China, you know, 1.4 billion people, they had nowhere to go except stay in China. I mean, yes, there are, you know, you could go immigrate to, I don't know, Hong Kong or Taiwan or something. But I mean, realistically speaking, China's internal reforms were going to really have real meaning. And in North Korea's case, I think they would create a kind of Berlin Wall collapse, and I think with the end of the regime. So I think the North Koreans have been very reluctant to do anything. And you've been there, I've been there. I was kind of shocked by, I mean, I had been in Eastern Europe in the 70s, 80s. I was used to roadside markets. I was looking for signs like that. All I saw was sort of the equivalent of dollar stores that you used to see in Poland and Hungary, and I saw those with, you know, high quality whiskey and Pyongyang, but I don't think that's something that's really on a reform track. So I'm just not seeing it, the reforms that you cite.